In the film The Death of Stalin, we witness an emblematic moment that goes beyond historical narrative to become a metaphor for power and trust. The execution of Beria, head of the secret police and a symbol of the regime's abuses, represents not only the end of a character, but the closing of a cycle of fear and violence. Around his body, members of the party's inner circle watch in silence, carrying the weight of political decisions that will shape the Soviet Union's future. Among them is Malenkov, the interim leader, reluctantly accepting the decision, appearing fragile and hesitant in the face of events. In this context, Khrushchev, already emerging as the new leader, asks Kaganovich a question that resonates beyond the scene. Can a weak man be trusted? Kaganovich's curt reply, "Have you ever trusted someone who is weak?" not only defines the perception of Malenkov, but also opens space for a universal reflection on the relationship between weakness, trust, and power. The scene, blending irony with seriousness, establishes a starting point to question to what extent strength is a prerequisite for trust, and how politics, philosophy, and even our personal relationships are shaped by this dynamic. The distrust surrounding weakness is not limited to politics or figures like Malenkov. It extends to how we perceive people in everyday life. In general, we associate weakness with a lack of firmness, an inability to stand by a decision or hold a position under pressure. And when someone cannot remain steady, doubt naturally arises. How can we trust this person? Trust demands consistency, the belief that the other will keep their word, honor commitments, and follow a clear course of action. Weakness, whether emotional, moral, or of character, generates uncertainty and, with it, undermining credibility. This does not mean that every fragile individual is incapable of kindness, but rather that in the absence of firmness, they rarely inspire the security needed for others to rely on them. This is precisely what the film highlights. Malenkov's hesitant image reveals how a leader's lack of solidity makes him incompatible with the trust the role requires. For Nietzsche, weakness was not a neutral condition, much less a detail that could be ignored without consequence. He saw in weakness something deeper and more dangerous, a form of dishonesty. It was not about lacking muscles, bravery in battle, or public confidence, but about being unable to look at oneself with sincerity. The weak, in his view, deceive themselves about their own feelings and desires, creating justifications that mask their inability to act. This dishonesty is not only toward oneself, but also toward the surrounding world. Because those who fail to show integrity transmit insecurity and inconsistency. For Nietzsche, to be weak is to be unable to sustain one's own truth before life. At this point, he breaks with the common view that weakness can be neutral with no major implications. For him, weakness is corrosive because it undermines both internal and external trust. There is a crucial difference between simply failing to achieve a goal and deceiving oneself about that failure. For Nietzsche, making mistakes, stumbling, or failing to achieve something is not the real problem. Failure is part of life and can even drive learning. What he condemned intensely was the stance of those who, when defeated, prefer to hide behind excuses or comforting illusions instead of facing reality as it is. This lie to oneself is the essence of weakness, not admitting frustrated desire, not accepting the pain of loss, and instead creating an inner narrative to soften the impact of truth. Strength, therefore, does not lie in always winning, but in standing firm when things do not go as expected. In taking responsibility for one's limits without falsifying the facts. Weakness, on the contrary, is this refusal of honesty, this flight disguised as serenity. When we fail to obtain what we deeply desire, whether love, power, recognition, or independence, a defense mechanism often arises that Nietzsche describes as dangerous: resentment. Instead of admitting failure, weakness, or defeat by circumstances, we tend to devalue what we once longed for. It is as if we told ourselves, it was not worth it, it was never that important. This reversal of values does not erase desire. It only deforms it into bitterness. It is at this point that weakness shows its most corrosive side. It not only prevents us from achieving something, but also leads us to degrade the very object of our desire, as if that were the only way to ease frustration. For Nietzsche, this process creates a spiral of negativity that poisons vitality and fosters a spirit of bitterness, where dishonesty with oneself becomes permanent. Weakness also manifests when the will is disorganized, when inner impulses do not move in the same direction. Instead of a center that governs and unifies action, the weak person is divided by contradictory desires, each pulling in a different way. He wants something but fears the consequences, seeks greatness but retreats into mediocrity. This fragmentation of will creates paralysis and a life marked by hesitation and inconsistency. For Nietzsche, to be strong does not mean to have a perfect will, but to be able to align it, to organize impulses into a coherent movement. Weakness, by contrast, is the state of someone who never fully chooses, who gets lost in inner conflicts without assuming a clear direction. This inner disorder, more than any external enemy, undermines self-trust and the respect of others. This instability of will can be seen not only in philosophy, but also in historical and literary examples Nietzsche helps us interpret. In The Death of Stalin, Malenkov embodies this condition. Placed in power after the dictator's death, he shows no clarity or firmness, letting himself be shaped by others. His figure transmits dependence, revealing how the lack of organized will opens space for others to dominate. Likewise, in English history, we find King Edward I, who, despite the crown's formal power, was constantly pulled by external forces, unable to impose his vision or sustain coherent decisions. These examples show that weakness is not total absence of power, but the inability to direct power from inner unity. It is an apparent rule, based more on position or circumstance than true strength of character. For Nietzsche, overcoming this dispersion requires commitment and self-overcoming. Here emerges the figure of the Übermensch, not as a supernatural being, but as someone able to create and live by their own values, free from dogma or external approval. Strength lies not only in resisting the world's pressures, but in internal organization, aligning each impulse and action toward one horizon. This unity of will gives authenticity. The strong person does not live by imposed rules, but by an order they establish for themselves. The weak lose themselves in contradictions, trying to please or to hide. The strong build a life coherent with what they desire, think, and do. Self-overcoming is not about denying oneself, but about creatively aligning conflicts, turning them into sources of strength rather than paralysis. Nietzsche also gives special attention to pity and compassion when used manipulatively. For him, pity does not always come from genuine help. Often it is disguised weakness, a way to keep others dependent and thus reinforce one's own power. By offering help without allowing strength, a relation of submission is created, masked as kindness. True magnanimity, he argued, comes when one so secure in themselves gives without control. This genuine aid encourages autonomy and growth, while manipulative pity traps people in weakness. Nietzsche's critique is not a condemnation of kindness, but of the weakness that hides behind apparent goodness. A central concept in his philosophy is amor fati, the love of fate, which means affirming life fully, including suffering and loss. It is not passive resignation, but turning pain into strength and growth. Nietzsche, who lived with chronic illness, used his own suffering as an example of how pain can become reflection and creativity. For him, strength was not power over others, but mastery of oneself, organizing will and embracing life without resentment. By loving fate, one affirms existence and finds meaning even in adversity, living fully and authentically, independent of others' pity or approval. Nietzsche saw philosophies of weakness, extreme pessimism, certain forms of Christianity, and antinatalism as poisons to the human spirit. To deny or belittle life for fear of suffering is, for him, disguised surrender that weakens both individuals and societies. These ideas spread passive nihilism, corroding values, vitality, and the will to embrace life. The alternative, Nietzsche insisted, is to affirm life courageously, with honesty and enthusiasm, embracing both joys and hardships as parts of a destiny to be loved and lived. Only in this way can true strength, self-overcoming, and trust arise, breaking free from the weakness that paralyzes and corrupts. In the end, the reflection that emerges is clear. Weakness, whether in politics, philosophy, or personal life, is not merely a lack of strength, but a refusal to confront reality with honesty and coherence. Nietzsche challenges us to see that true trust and authority are only possible where there is unity of will and the courage to affirm life as it is. The death of Stalin and the hesitation of Malenkov are not just historical episodes, but symbols that expose a timeless truth, that only those who overcome themselves, who embrace destiny without excuses, can truly lead and inspire. To reject weakness is not to demand perfection, but to demand integrity. It is the first step toward building confidence, vitality, and a life lived with authenticity.